Welcome, everybody. We are so pleased you are all here today. I'm Bill Hevlin, and I'll be your worship associate for today's UU Coastside Community Service. All are welcome here, whether or not you believe in God or a higher source, hold to humanist or secular teachings, if you come from another religion, or if you've always been Unitarian Universalist. You are welcome here. The UU Coastside community welcomes all people of all skin tones, the LGBTQ plus community, kids and mature folks, those with life challenges, and those temporarily without such challenges. For here we are working to overcome our society's systemic biases, and you specifically are most welcome here today. We're happy to welcome back Clovice Lewis to the UUCC pulpit. His talk is entitled Breaking the Silence with Martin Luther King Jr., where he asks us to consider how urgently important Dr. King was as the moral conscience of our nation. Once again, we find it necessary to listen to the words of Martin Luther King Jr., because the warnings he sounded about nonviolence not so long ago remain painfully relevant today. By the way, Facebook rejected our ad for Clovice's service today. Kind of makes you extra curious, huh? Anyway, after the service today, I hope you stay on Zoom to join our usual small random breakout groups that give us a chance to discuss thoughts from today's service. And now, Clovice has some opening words for us.
We welcome you all today. I'd like to open the service with the following words. A few years ago, Bill Moyers spoke about the forces that drove him from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, where he'd been a journalist for over 40 years. He spoke eloquently about how the forces of ideology and intolerance have done so much damage to our American psyche over the preceding 5 years. And at one point in his speech, he said, "Ideology masking as policy, both foreign and domestic, brings us to profound spiritual challenges." Martin Luther King Jr. looked out from his position as a leader of a fledgling civil rights movement in the 1960s and saw many of the same dangers Bill Moyers now talks about. Listen to what Moyers had to say about patriotism. "I wore my flag tonight, first time. Until now, I haven't thought it necessary to display a little metallic icon of patriotism for everyone to see. It was enough to vote, pay my taxes, perform my civic duties, speak my mind, and do my best to raise my kids to be good Americans. It no more occurred to me to flaunt the flag on my chest than it did to pin my mother's picture on my lapel to prove her son's love. And when I see flags sprouting on official lapels, I think of the time when in China, when I saw Mao Zedong's little red book of orthodoxy on every official's desk, omnipresent and unread." In today's sermon, Breaking the Silence with Martin Luther King Jr., I will speak about the kind of blind allegiance to ideology that sucks the spiritual life out of a nation and leads it into well-intentioned folly. Sadly, I believe, the dangers of collective unconsciousness Martin Luther King Jr. talked about so long ago have been repeated, much to our peril of late. And now our opening hymn this morning is "We Are a Gentle, Angry People" by Holler. It's number 170 in the UU hymnal. It's arranged by Tom Devine and sung by Tom and Linda Grace Frost. So please, if you will, rise in body and spirit and raise your voice or just listen to this beautiful hymn. We are a gentle, angry people.
We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are all in this together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are all in this together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives.
Singing for Our Lives. I love that song. This is our UUCC chalice. Light the UUCC chalice flame. Please join in reading these words by the Reverend Jami A. Yandel, The Sacred Power of Justice. We light this flame to ignite the sacred power of justice. We light this flame so that it may be a beacon of hope in moments of uncertainty, fear, anxiety, and the unknown. We light this flame and are emboldened by its blaze, knowing our strength as a prophetic and powerful people is rooted in the diverse ways we answer the call to love.
And now we light a second chalice, this in honor of National Native American Heritage Month in November, in honor of the peoples indigenous to this region, the Ramaytush Ohlone, who lived on this land before occupation by Europeans. Please join me in reading this land acknowledgement. UUCC acknowledges that Half Moon Bay is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, recognizes that, as the original stewards of this land, the Ramaito Shaloni understood profoundly the interconnectedness of all things and maintained for millennia harmony with nature. Today, UUCC honors the Ramaitush Ohlone peoples for their inspiring commitment to Mother Earth. And now for joys and concerns. In a moment, we'll play a video where we'll invite you to share your joys and concerns. While the video is playing, please feel free to share your joys and concerns in the chat window and to read what is shared there by others. And just to remind you, for upcoming services, if you have any joys and concerns that you would specifically like the worship associate to read aloud, please email us prior to the service. One of the ways we create our beloved community is by sharing our own joys and our concerns with one another and finding support from our community. At this time, we invite you to click the chat button at the bottom middle of your Zoom window. That brings up a window in which you can type any joys or concerns. As you do so, we will hear Vera Vandershock play La Grima by Francisco Tarrega. In these times of reflection and renewal, let us remember that it remains important to reach out to one another when we feel the need, and to accept being reached out to. May we find comfort in knowing that we can share our joys and our concerns here among us. Some things from UUCC itself. Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam, who were convicted 55 years ago of the 1965 assassination of Malcolm X, were exonerated this last week. Islam died in 2009. Aziz is now 83. We bow our heads, for we find ourselves as witnesses this week, not to justice, for this injustice now righted has come too late. We bow our heads not to justice, but merely to a correction to history. And we grieve with the families of Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Huber, who on August 25th, 2020, were shot and killed by Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And we extend our sympathies to Gage Grosskreutz, whom Rittenhouse shot and wounded in the same incident. And we mourn with the family of Ahmaud Arbery, whose killers are currently on trial for murder in Brunswick, Georgia. And we are called to mourn again for the family of Heather Heyer, who in August 2017 was killed at Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, for the trial of the white nationalist, and neo-Nazi organizers of that event, jury deliberations are now underway. May we hold with love and care the joys and concerns that have been shared publicly today, as well as those that remain unspoken in the recesses of our hearts. Before I introduce our guest speaker, Clovice has a reading for us.
We'll read number 646, The Larger Circle by Wendell. You'll see the slide there. And I'll just read the entire thing, and if you'd like to respond with the italics, that would be great. We clasp the hands of those that go before us, and the hand of those who come after us. We enter the little circle of each other's arms, and the circle of lovers whose hands are joined in a dance, and the larger circle of all creatures, passing in and out of life, who move also in a dance, to a music so subtle and vast that no ear hears it, except in fragments.
It is with great pleasure today that I introduce our worship leader today, Clovice Lewis. Clovice received a Master of Divinity degree from Star King School for the Ministry in May of 2021 and is in the process of becoming an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. His ministry emphasizes breaking down racial, class, and ethnic barriers and preaching the gospel of the madness of human extinction. Welcome back, Clovice.
And after the suburbs, America, where will you go? Where will you flee to escape from the plague that sweeps from the rotted inner core of your once prided cities? And where will you teach your children, America? Will you build your churches higher? Can you afford the hypocrisy, the two-faced scandal of equality for all men? And how will you teach your children, America? Will you teach them to love and respect each other for the sake of our integrity? Or will they live as you have lived, in fear, hate, and mistrust? And after the suburbs, America, where will you go? Tell me, America, I want to know. That was the opening song for a tribute to the life of Martin Luther King Jr. I also used it in a play called On the Fence. I composed that when I was 14 years old in Abilene, Texas. The year was 1970. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated just 2 weeks before, and I, like millions of others, was still deeply affected by his loss. And probably more importantly, by the unshakable feeling that our country had turned a terrible corner. The optimism of the 60s was brutally erased by the assassinations of the Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King Jr. And since that time, many of us feel there's some shadowy, dark group of people manipulating world events. I feel that in a more pronounced way than I ever have these days. In 1970, I got as far as composing that song that I just sang because I thought, even though I could imagine the Martin Luther King Jr. peace cantata, I did not have the compositional skills to complete the entire piece. I intended to set some of his writings to music. The culmination of the piece, of course, would be the magnificent I Have a Dream speech, which I thought was the most powerful and eloquent oratory ever spoken by an American person. Now, to my young mind, that speech was the essence of what an American should ascribe to, because it resonates with our great nation's soul, I thought it should be attached as a postamble to the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, or somehow enshrined as a separate, albeit kind of long article in the Constitution. So preparing for this speech during the pre-Trump era, I could not help but ask myself, what would Martin Luther King Jr. say about the world we live in? And I imagine he would ask why we'd seek to impeach President Clinton for lying about sex with an intern, but not seek to impeach President Bush for lying about weapons of mass destruction, and then using that as a pretext for invading another sovereign country. And Martin Luther King Jr. might have problems with an executive branch that exempted itself from laws against the use of torture. He might feel something is very familiar about our government spying on its citizens. He could tell us a thing or two about FBI wiretaps used to discredit him. He was a subversive, after all, because he and his Confederates were attempting to overthrow legal segregation in the South. Recall that the government was protecting us against him at the time. I firmly believe King would be one of those fiercely raising his voice against the notion of an endless war on terror. And we would hear him say the exact words he spoke on April 4th, 1967, at a meeting of clergy and laity concerned about our war in Vietnam at the Riverside Church in New York City. And this is what he said at that time. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I've tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they asked me, and rightly so, well, what about Vietnam? They asked me if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent. Those magnificent words about the eternal nature of violence were spoken by Martin Luther King Jr. many years ago, yet they ring true today. Allow me to read the first 3 paragraphs of that address. I invite you to think about our present situation with the use of violence on an international scale, and how it so eerily relates to the time when King spoke those words. Do as I did, and replace the word Vietnam with the phrase war on terror, and you may glean the timeless wisdom of King's position. He said, I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join with you in this meeting because I am in deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organization which has brought us together, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. The recent statement of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I find myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexed as they often do, in the case of this dreadful conflict. We are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty, but we must move on. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And we must rejoice as well, for surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us. If it is, let us trace its movement well and pray that our own inner being may be sensitive to its guidance, for we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems to close around us. The speech entitled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence is probably the least well-known of Dr. King's speeches, but I believe it must be read with new eyes for a new generation. Of course, the I Have a Dream speech is timeless, but this one is quite timely and is painfully appropriate for this moment in history. Some of you have heard me speak on the subject of compassion and justice. I have challenged many congregations over the years to consider the moral consequences of prosecuting this war on terror. In a sermon entitled Spiritual Challenges of Asymmetrical War, on September 26th, 2001, I said this: as a nation, we must learn to defend ourselves and at the same time try to understand the circumstances of disenfranchisement, bitterness, and hopelessness that created those with whom we are now engaged. As human beings, we must reach out to each other when it seems impossible to do so. As members of a spiritual community, we must look inside ourselves for the God who has the power to transform the world. And we must understand on a molecular level that we are all responsible for everything that happens and that we are bound inextricably to one another. Yes, we should pray. And so will our enemies to the same God. Yes, we should defend ourselves by launching attacks so devastating and awful, shock and awe, that they will make the entire world afraid to attack us. But they will, and do so with ever more terrible consequences. We call our enemies evil, but discount the evil inside of us. We will dance the maddening dance of war and will bathe in unspeakable and secret places. And when we are exhausted from our mutual struggles that go on perhaps for generations, there will be the time for putting aside our weapons. Then it's entirely possible we will embrace each other and be best friends, perhaps united in a common struggle against those pesky outer space aliens. My friends, what has decades of years of warfare revealed to us? We now see the consequences of this bathing in unspeakable and secret places that I warned of. Consider this, all of this, in the light of what we now know about Abu Ghraib prison, Guantanamo Bay, the rendering of people to be tortured in other countries in our name, the thousands of innocent Iraqi and Afghani citizens dead, the outing of intelligence operatives who disagree with our national policies, the erosions of our civil liberties, the revelations that our government has been spying on us. Please understand me. My intention is not to turn this sermon into a political speech. I want to honor a great American who had enormous insight and wisdom concerning social injustice and lack of compassion, and how that ultimately leads to spiritual bankruptcy that can poison an entire world. I'm not a genius politician. I'm not a prophet. However, many of you can attest that I predicted our current spiritual and moral crisis regarding the war on terror a long time ago, when I talked about violence. The accuracy of my predictions is pretty easy to explain. They derive from an understanding that we have sacrificed our spiritual compass for the sake of political expediency. King was able to do the same thing 50 years ago. And in his case, he was a political genius and a prophet. Listen to what he said on April 4th, 1967. Here's the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence when it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. For from this view, we may indeed see the basic weaknesses of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition. Somehow, this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and a brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America, who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path that we have taken. I speak as an American to the leaders of my own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution as a nation, we must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that people and men and women will be you're not constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It's not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it looks across the seas and see individuals, capitalists of the West, investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of those countries, and say, this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say, this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into veins of people normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. America, the greatest, richest, and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There's nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war. There's nothing to keep us from molding a recalcitrant status quo with bruised hands until we have fashioned it into a brotherhood. Tell me, if a man like King could see nearly 50 years ago where we are now, what does that say about who we are as a nation? I feel like I have a moral and spiritual giant speaking for me in the person of Martin Luther King Jr. He was able to say much more eloquently than I could wish to say about the importance of practicing our UU principles and being witnesses to their transformative power. I'll end this sermon today with the conclusion of the one I delivered a long time ago. It says what I want to say today. We know everything we need to know about how to end wars before they begin. It's a mistake to believe that our governments are going to solve the deep problems the world is encountering. Those problems are not rooted in governments, but in the hearts and minds and spirits of people. Young people who do not have jobs, don't have homelands, do not have power over their future, who live in squalor, who have been nourished with a steady diet of violence and hatred all their lives. Those are the people we need to care for. That kind of care and compassion does not come from governments, but from each individual person making conscious decisions every day about the kind of world they want to live in. Compassion, love, honesty, patience, and integrity need to be practiced by each individual so that we can infuse our children with those qualities and thereby create governments that reflect those values and make them the cornerstone of policy, both domestic and foreign. The world is now too small for human beings to treat it like it's not a schoolyard. And we all know the rules that Robert Fulghum reminds us of, which we learned in kindergarten, but have somehow forgotten. Treat others as you would have them treat you. Ask for forgiveness. Say please. Walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Apologize when you hurt someone. Take care of each other. Don't push. Always share. And listen when someone else is talking. Namaste. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. That was the year that Diane Carroll received the Golden Globe Award for Best Actress in a Television Series for her title role as Julia. It was the first series on American television to star a black woman in a non-stereotypical role. And I remember that time well because aside from Nichelle Nichols' role in Star Trek, there were precious few black people on television. In 1969, Moms Mabley sang Abraham, Martin, and John on the Merv Griffin Show, and she electrified our nation. I remembered that. I watched it. And I remember it as the most moving song that I had ever heard. Her performance is seared in my mind because in that time, when black folks were relegated to step and fetch it stereotypes, moms blew open the doors of dignity and compassion. Her tribute was exactly what our nation needed.
Anybody here seen my old friend Abraham? Can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, but it seems a good die young. I just looked around and he was gone. Has anybody here seen my old friend John? Can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, but it seems a good die young. I just looked around and he was gone. Has anybody here seen my old friend Martin Luther? Can you tell me where he's gone? You know, he freed a lot of people, but it seems a good die young. I just looked around and he was gone. Didn't you love the things he stood for? Didn't they try to find some good for you and me? And we'll be free someday soon. Oh, it's got to be one day. Anybody here seen my little Bobby? Can you tell me where he's gone? I thought I saw him walking over the hill. Abraham, Martin, and John. They were going home, just going home.
Well, it's always so nice to hear such beautiful music. And I just want to say, I feel like I've really listen to a song that is very heartfelt by Clovice. And I also feel that about the sermon from Clovice, that it's really, he's really speaking from his heart. And I also want to thank you for reminding us of the importance of Dr. King's legacy and how we can continue to work together for peaceful solutions to social injustice and inequality. For Dr. King's legacy and for you reminding us of his legacy, we are most grateful. And this is the season of being grateful. This season of gratitude is now upon us. And I want to say how profoundly grateful I am for all of you who zoomed in today. And for that matter, for all of you who are watching this service on YouTube in moments yet to arrive. And I have discovered that gratitude is both an attitude and also a viewpoint from which we can look out and regard life. It's sunny days, it's rainy days, it's achy days. Gratitude can be practiced, can be cultivated, and once grown, gratitude grows into and becomes a part of us, a better part of us. So let us now turn to the practice of gratitude for UUCC today. We thank you for giving in whatever ways feel the most impactful for you. Your generosity, bearing your trust, offering your time, sharing your skills, your voices, this is all most deeply appreciated. And if you donate dollars today, your donations help UUCC to continue to endure, to thrive, really. For UUCC is becoming, and we want you, all of you, to become with us. As your generous spirit moves you today, please feel free to contribute what you can to UUCC, either by check or online. The instructions for giving are also in the chat. While these collections take place, let's take a few moments to hear our UUCC co-side hymn called We of the Co-side, with lyrics by, well, me, and music by Tom Devine and voices from the UUCC choir.
We of the coastside, we care for our neighbors, seek for more justice and sing for more peace, open in heart and bringing more love for all. We of the coastside, we care for our neighbors, seek for more justice and sing for more peace, open in justice and sing for more peace, open in heart and sing for more peace, we of justice and sing for more peace, seek for more justice and sing for more peace, open in justice and sing for love for all.
And now for some announcements. We thank UU San Mateo for their invaluable administrative and professional support. We want to acknowledge the continued support of the UU community of Lake County during our shelter-in-place times. Regular attendance on Zoom from UUCLC helps bolster morale for our production teams as our hard work is appreciated by a larger audience. UUCC welcomes the Reverend Summer Albayati on December 5th with a sermon entitled Embodied Healing and Rituals, Sufi Islam's Pathway to Peace and Love. Experts tell us that we are in liminal times and experiencing collective trauma that yearns to be healed. What can we learn from the Sufi Islamic embodiment rituals practice to bring more healing into our own lives and communities? How can embracing embodied healing help heal and lead us to collective salvation, freedom, peace, and love? Reverend Summer Albayati is a UU Muslim of Iraqi descent and is currently working on a book regarding Islam, the Quran, and liberation theology. UUCC pays tribute to all faiths and life-affirming belief systems with this year's all-music holiday extravaganza, curated by music director Tom Devine. All together for the holidays, we'll pay tribute to Christmas, Hanukkah, Pagan Wiccan Yule, Panchaganapati, Bodhi Day, and Kwanzaa, and maybe more. Last year, UUCC raised over $5,000 for the Coastside Adult Day Health Center. This year's recipient will be Senior Coastsiders. Senior Coastsiders provides opportunities, support, and resources for older adults and adults with disabilities living on the coastside, from Montera to Pescadero and Skyline to the sea. An amazing collection of December holiday music will be curated by Tom Devine. Don't miss out on the fun. Mark your calendars for December 19th. And now, Dave will guide us in extinguishing the chalice.
We now extinguish the chalice flames. Please join in reading these words by Elizabeth Selleck Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Someday, we will live in a country that looks like the one Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned decades ago. In that nation, a person will be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. Perhaps we will then live in a world where people understand that we are deeply and inextricably connected to one another. And the concept of one nation, of a nation, is just a geographical point of reference. Maybe we won't live with war or violence. Let us each go into the world, pledging to each carry the light of justice, equity, and compassion. Let us be kind to ourselves and to one another until we meet again. And now our closing hymn this morning, or this afternoon, We'll Build a Land, which is number 121 in the UU hymnal, arranged by Tom Devine and sung by Tom, Linda Grace Frost, and Shauna Pickett Gordon. So please, again, rise in body and or spirit and add your voice, or just listen to the beautiful hymn, We'll Build a Land.
We'll
Thanks to everyone who contributed to this wonderful, enlightening service today. Thank you, Clovice, for your inspirational, heartfelt words. Already, I'm looking forward to your return engagement. We also want to acknowledge our third Sunday production team. Sparkly and spunky chalice lighter, Dave Rakowski. Magical artistic director and top chef, Noreen Cooper-Hevlin. Our session management engineer and video editor, Bruce, the Maker Raffnell. Sound engineer, Rob Carey. That's Rob Fingers Carey. We also want to acknowledge our talented music director, the miraculously slow whistling Tom Devine, the resilient UUCC choir, and special guest vocalists Shauna Pickett-Gordon and Linda Grace Frost. And thanks to Vera Vandershock for her gorgeous classical guitar pieces played during Gathering and Joys and Concerns. And a big thank you to all of you for participating in this timely service. Da-dum! And if that's too much excitement for a credit slide, well, that's where gratitude sometimes takes you. Okay, so immediately following the service, I'll create some breakout rooms for us, which will serve as a safe space to talk openly and honestly about today's topic or anything else that might be on our minds. So let's all join these breakout rooms. What is said here stays here. And of course, thoughts and concepts we learn and are inspired by can most definitely be shared. Please be thoughtful of the time so that anyone who wishes to speak has the opportunity to do so. So, Clovice offers the following discussion points to consider. What do you think Martin Luther King Jr. would say about our endless war on terror? Clovice once visited the Dachau concentration camp in Germany. When he entered the compound, he was an avowed pacifist. Clovice left there feeling that violence to counter oppression and evil is sometimes inevitable and necessary. What do you think about that? Drone strikes, precision bombings, and artificial intelligence heighten the fog of war for civilians and remove us from what is done in our name. Are Martin Luther King Jr.'s words about seeing the enemy's point of view still truly possible? In just a few moments, I'll give everybody permission to unmute themselves. Have a very safe, very happy, and grateful day, and happy Thanksgiving.